Well, in the book that Tomorrow's published called The Thin Black Line, which was about Vinny, I wrote something very
positive. It's a book about Coletta?
Yeah, I wrote something positive about him. I said that when I went into comic books, the mantra that I learned was from Sparky Moore and Mike Aarons, which was you get your first job on your ability, and every job after that, your dependability. Now, things are different now decades later, but what Vinny was the guy that if you gave him a book on Friday and you said you needed it Tuesday, it was there Monday afternoon. Despite what...
Because he erased half the book.
He was reliable.
And that's what the editors cared the most about. Because nobody expected that someone 50 years later would be analyzing this work. What they cared about was that they never missed their production schedule, because that's how they made it. If they missed one book a year, they blew the budget for the whole year.
I mean, I understand. So Vince Coletta was Mr. Reliable, and he probably came into the office or something, and he knocked it out.
He put his wife to work, his son to work.
I know. He had the Williamson crinkle on his book.
He had the special crinkle and inks.
But Tomorrow's and those guys, did they manage to recover like all or most of the Kirby art? If Vince was erasing his stats or something, did they have the pencils so that we can see the original art where Jack did the backgrounds?
Jack got one of the first Xerox machines when he moved to California, because if the mail lost his art going to New York, they would have a backup of the Xeroxes to work from.
I'm sure they lost Kirby packages all the time.
Practically the entire Tomorrow's publishing empire is built upon those Xeroxes, which came from Greg Things.
But the Fourth World has been published as pencils on many occasions. So anyway, like I said, you can look at those Coletta books and they're blank
commissions for Tom Kraft, where he has sent me copies of Jack's pencils of pages that were inked by Vinny.
Yeah.
And I have inked them.
You're the guy.
Now, I would have inked Jack.
Well, I'm pleased with that.
Well, Jack was very political when people would say, "Who is your favorite inker?" He'd say, well, you know, Giacory has these strings and Senate has this.
I don't want to cause anybody to lose any work or anything.
But after he left comic books, and particularly at the wake at his house after he was interred, people were asking Roz who was Jack's favorite inker. And she didn't know I was like leaning over her shoulder, but she said, Mike Royer. And it's because I finished his statement in ink.
I agree. You did.
And because I didn't know any better. I loved his work, and I wanted
You certainly weren't putting any kind of editorial into it to say, I'm going to take this background figure out or anything nuts like that. You were just realizing his pencils.
Well, now, there are people who have asked me over the years, what is the difference between Joe Sinnott and Mike Royer? And they say you have to have a little bit of an understanding.
Not like this, I think.
Well, a little understanding of the motion picture industry and the studio structures, the dichotomy in the golden age of movies. Joe Sinnott inked Jack Kirby, MGM.
Okay.
I inked Jack Kirby, Warner Brothers.
Gangster.
Because that's who Jack was.
That is fascinating and hilarious, but can you kind of break it down?
I thought it was a little high and inside, David.
And
go ahead.
Which can you kind of break that up for the people who are not students of film, to how that would break up into the art?
And something I want to interject real quick is, I think Joe Sinnott inking on Kirby, it almost looks like a real shiny convertible advertising image where everything's sleek and smooth, futuristic. Then when Royer inks Jack, it brings out the inner Jack Kirby. There's a craggled, imperfect, monstrous depiction of humanity, and you really channeled that so well, better than anyone else.
Well, in the motion picture structure, MGM was like the premier motion picture studio. One of their advertising lines was all the stars in heaven. It was every dollar spent in that movie, you saw it on the screen. The gloss, the shine, the stars, the large cast, group scenes, and so on. But Jack grew up in love with Warner Brothers programmers, and what Jack put on the page was all that was necessary to tell the story. And I knew when I met Jack that he really had this love for Warner Brothers movies. So to me, Joe is MGM and I was Warner Brothers. And I love Joe's work. I think he was absolutely one of the most incredible talents to ever pencil and or both in the history of comic books.
But you know, I think you may have defined why the DC stuff, for whatever reason, just took my heart. Well, I love that Marvel stuff. It's a little bit distant to me, most of those books. I was more of a Spider-Man guy, and the Kirby Marvel stuff for me, when I was a kid, I knew it and I respected it, but there's, like you say, there was a sheen on that where I felt like the DC stuff, like these dots, it was like lava bubbling off the page, you know, and your work and whatever, Mike Thibodeau, or I don't know, whoever was over there in DC, good stuff.
But also Stan would ask Joe to do things like pretty up the girls, things like that. And later, there's a much greater reverence for Jack. When he went to DC, he finally kind of got the respect he deserved from Carmine. And Carmine had to fight his bosses, Warner Brother bosses, to get Jack.
They redrew a lot of girls. They redrew a lot of girls on Jack Comics in DC.
Show me one.
Oh, I mean, like the Jimmy Olsen books. I mean, no, that's not girls, but Al Plastino was drawing Jimmy and
They
Superman.
redrew some Superman faces.
Yeah.
And Carmine told me that Jack never complained about that when it was happening. Now later, in hindsight,
I phoned the DC offices. I said, if you're going to change Jimmy Olsen's face and Superman's, send me the model sheets you want me to follow, and I'll do it so at least it all comes from the same inker's hand.
yeah, that's a good. That's.
It looked like they had stats of Al Plastino on Jimmy Olsen on those Kirby
yeah,
books.
and as they put, that was their most Superman was their most valuable licensed property, and also, the way I understood it was that the top brass at DC, they had more leeway on every character but Batman and Superman, because those were the two most valuable characters.
Marketing.
That anything that was off character would be referred to as off character, off model.
Off model.
It had to go through Warner Brothers, and that was problematic. It slowed production, it caused problems. So the easiest thing for them to do was to either have Plastino or Murphy Anderson to do it in-house.
Well, the bottom line is licensing and merchandising those characters. Now, I convinced the people at Disney to have Jack draw the Sunday strip, The Black Hole. But on every one of those Sunday pages, I had to fix the robots because Jack was an impressionist. But to protect the trademarks for merchandise, it had to be exactly on model.
Is that a book? Is that published by Vanguard Publishing?
I would love to collect Black Hole. So far, I think I talked to you about it. If you had any Disney contacts, do you have any contacts at Disney that might be able to help get it approved?
I have the proof.
To collect the publishing deal, the publishing rights, the publishing deal.
Oh, to get the rights to
I need a contact at Disney to work with.
I have no contacts.
Right, but I've been interested in the Black Hole for years, collecting that because it's never been collected.
I don't know what your business relationship is with Renee, but she has a Disney license. Maybe she could find out something for you. Because hell,
if she hears this, she may try to cut me out of the deal.
You know, I want to throw out.
I'll take care of Renee.
All right.
are you listening, darling?
Hey, everybody speak up except for when you said the name Renee. And then go.
But something I want to throw out there on the 60s versus the 70s and Sinnott versus Royer, and Dave will probably have something to say about this, but the 60s mentality had a lot of optimism to it. So it seemed like having a shiny, space era type of inker made sense for the Fantastic Four. The 70s, if you look at a lot of that stuff, it takes a darker turn. There's more interest in dark pulp stories and things like that. So for having a comic like The Demon by Jack Kirby and have someone like Mike Royer inking the Demon, that made a lot of sense. That fit perfectly.
When Jack left Marvel to go to DC, I was supposed to be part of the package because he first wanted an inker on the West Coast, and after the first couple of things I did for him, he realized how faithful I was and how I felt about finishing his pencils. So I was going to be part of the package, but DC wouldn't have. Either they had a contract with Coletta or whatever it was, and of course Jack wanted to make sure that Vinny wouldn't lose any work, so he didn't fight real hard. But eventually they acquiesced because they thought I would fail, and to their chagrin, I didn't.
When Jack first went to DC, Carmine, Jack had actually been blacklisted from DC in the 50s when he was doing, he was working on Challengers of the Unknown, but he was also doing newspaper strip, Sky Masters. And he had a deal with a DC editor who helped him get that newspaper strip. And the strip started, it wasn't doing well, and he thought he shouldn't be required to pay this percentage to the editor. You know, he thought he was going to pay him one time, and the editor says, no, you got to pay me every time you get a check. I need to get a check. And so that relationship broke down, and it ruined Jack's relationship with DC in the 50s. It took him, he wanted to leave Marvel when Wally Wood and Steve Ditko left in 1965, but he couldn't because he couldn't get back into DC yet. Until Carmine got promoted to a high-ranking position, he was able to get him in. He got him the best, most lucrative contract in the history of comic books in America at the time. He was editing, penciling, writing, and eventually picked his own inker. But when they first made that deal...
Don't pick it, it'll never get well.
Pardon me?
Don't pick it, it'll never get well.
That's what I heard. When they first made the deal, the inking wasn't included, but Vinny was there, and Vinny was one of the few inkers that worked both for Marvel and DC. So it kind of seemed logical that it would help build a bridge of style for the Marvel readership to bring them to read the DC books if they had an inker that Marvel was already familiar with, the Marvel readers were familiar with. So there was a certain logic there, and Vinny offered a discount. He says, if you give me all the Jack's books, I'll give you a page rate discount. And they knew he was going to meet the deadlines, and so they did it. And then Jack's like, no, I want my own inker. Oh, sorry, Jack, we already made a deal with Vinny. But eventually...
I don't want anybody to go without word.
You want to hear some real dirt? I don't think this has ever been said publicly.
I'm about to say some dirt.
I heard, and I don't forget where I got this. All right, so technically it's hearsay, but whoever it was is a good source.
Yeah.
And I don't repeat a lot of hearsay. But that Jack, I think Jack may have been visiting in New York and was at the DC office, and he bumped into Vinny, and he verbally took issue with Vinny.
Yeah, this is a true story. I've
about
heard
the
this.
inking, and that
So it must be true.
Vinny fancied himself a wise guy. You know what I'm saying to you?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, see?
He wasn't a made man. He knew some made men.
He was going to tell Kirby what's what.
But if he said, Kirby's from Brooklyn, you don't mess with Brooklyn, all right? So, but if Vinny said, oh yeah, that guy, they're going to find him in the swamps of Jersey next Tuesday, he would be found in the swamps of Jersey next Tuesday. Vinny told Jack to mind his own business. It's Jack's book.
That's right.
He's the editor, writer, penciler. He created the characters. It's Jack's book. He's going to mind his own. Jack was furious. Then he told Carmine, I got to have my inker. You've got to get rid of Vinny. And Carmine knew then.
It's funny when you hate like some media character, like I don't know, I hate the skipper on Gilligan's Island or something. I hate Vince Coletta. You know, I think he. Yeah, I hate Vince Coletta.
He's the polarizing figure.
Well, he ruined those books, and then that whole story about him standing up to Jack and saying, I'm going to do whatever I want to with your work. I realize that it's that I didn't know him and everything's gray and all that, but just like other media figures, he's a guy that will make my blood boil. Vince Coletta! It's like our superhero, David. Vince Coletta!
Well, I met Carmine years before I worked with Jack at DC. He was out in LA, and I spent an evening with Carmine and Alex Toth. A great evening. And at some point I said, well, Carmine, I really don't understand how the engravers do the color work. I said, I really don't know how they do the engravers create the color. And he says, it's magic, kid. That was his response. But I had lunch with Dick Giordano, I think, in '70 when I was in New York. And he says, Mike, he says, you're getting a reputation of being cocky. And I said, what do you mean? He says, well, you walked into Carmine's office and said, I can do a better job than Vinny. I should be inking Jack's books. Well, I was telling the truth. But Dick was a great guy. I would see him when he was out at Warner's, you know, in the bungalows. Anyway, I digress.
You know, something I want to actually throw out there real quick. So in the early 70s, you know, you worked with Jack on the DC stuff. Later 70s, he goes over to Marvel, working on Black Panther, the Eternals, and all that. And you inked a lot of those books too. Well, how was it? Was it the same exact working relationship you had with Jack, just inking the same pages
The
between the two
paychecks
companies?
came from DC and Marvel, but I worked with/for Jack Kirby. And I felt my job was to finish Jack's pencils or complete Jack's pencils. To not, well, in the IDW book, Pencils and Inks, I wrote the introduction. And I mentioned that Roz used to tease me about the letters they got. When my first books hit the stands, letters like, "Who the hell is this Royer character? Where is Vinny?" And I, in essence, in the introduction said that basically, this is a generation of people who have never seen undistilled Jack Kirby. So they were seeing undistilled Jack for the first time, and they were shocked by.
So that reminds me, I want to insert, when before Carmine became the publisher, editorial director, he was one of the top artists in the business, and later he came back to drawing. But occasionally he signed his work under an alias, Sinfa, with C for Carmine and Infa for Infantino. And they would get letters saying, "Who is this guy Sinfa imitating Infantino? Why would you hire him when you have the real Infantino?" So by seeing Royer's inks on Jack, people were seeing a more true representation of Kirby's art than they had ever seen. You know, there were very rare examples of Kirby inking his own work, but the general public, they didn't know if it was inked by Simon, they didn't know what it was or when it was, but it was very rare.
Mike, did you have a sense from looking at Jack's pages, could you tell if he enjoyed doing one page versus another page? Could you gather that? And if so, could you gather a sense of that from the DC stuff versus his later Marvel stuff?
No. Now, I never felt that there was a difference in the books. Every time I got a book from Jack, I'd pick up in person, or the next book, it would come the old post office special delivery. And the first two things that struck me when I opened New Gods 5, I opened the box and I was engulfed in this intoxicating aroma of Roy Cham cigars. And my second was I looked at the art and I says, "Royer, don't screw this up." And that was probably...
Mind your own business.
My working mantra from that point on, whether it was DC or Marvel, or even the Black Hole comic strip, it was, "Don't screw this up. Complete Jack's statement." And maybe that's because I tell people, it took me years to find out if I had my own personality, because I started in the business assisting Russ Manning, and I look at that first year's work I did with Russ, and I can't tell what I did. To me, that's what an assistant was supposed to do, was be invisible.
I think we're all really grateful to you also on that,
I
Mike,
would
for what you
ink
did.
guys like Doug Wildey and Mel Kiefer and Tony Strobel and Mike Aarons and Sparky Moore, and my whole point was it had to look like they finished it themselves.
That reminds me.
Hey,
We're doing the Kirby, but I just want to say about Mike. Anybody remember the original Marvel cartoons, like 1966?
When Captain America throws his mighty shield.
I worked on those.
Yeah, he worked on them.
The only guy at the studio who'd ever read a Marvel comic book.
Yeah, and Doug Wildey had done work for Marvel, Atlas in the 50s. I used to, the mention of Doug Wildey made me think.
I love Doug Wildey and those guys that were, in essence, my continuing mentors. Marvel superheroes went out of production at the same time that Western Publishing wanted more work from Russ Manning. He told them the only way they could get more work from him is if I assisted him. He couldn't pay me enough for a living. So they called me and said, "Would you like to come in and pick up work?" And the animation studio called a few months later, and I'm really busy with doing my own work for Gold Key, assisting Russ, and the animation studio said, "We're doing Amazing Spider-Man on Saturday morning for ABC. Can you come back?" And I said, "I could only give you 20 hours a week and I have to work at home." And the production manager said, "Well, then we can't give you screen credit." And a naive 20-something I could have gone to the Screen Cartoonists Union and told them, and they would have jumped all over him, and I would have gotten credit for laying out 1/3 of those 20 episodes. In fact, Grant Simmons, who was Grant of Grant Ray Lawrence, wanted me to be the voice of Spider-Man and Peter Parker. But Lawrence, the money man in New York, wanted to go with non-union Trillin in Canada. I worked directly with Grant Simmons.
Did I hear you say with great power comes great responsibility?
But Grant, on the third week, I'm delivering my layouts to him, and he says, Mike, we have a problem. And I said, what is it? He says, everybody in the studio is madder than hell at you. And I said, why? He says, because in your 20 hours, you're doing more work than they're doing in 40 hours in-house. I said, well, what do they do? He says, keep doing the work and bill me for 40. So everybody was happy, and I worked 20 hours a week and got paid for 40.
This is a show where Stan was the host?
No, earlier. The first 67. The Saturday morning.
This is the Ralph Bakshi show.
Yeah.
Before Bakshi.
Yeah, he came in.
Oh, I see, second season.
And Bakshi on the second season used lots of same-as material from the first season that we did, and Spidey would leap from one building to the building across the street, but it would take like 4 minutes of swinging through Manhattan to get there because they're using all this same-as.
That's why we love it so. Hey, so the question, you guys, that I asked at the beginning of the panel, and David, I want you guys to see if you can assist me with, I'd like to know. What is Mike's body of work at DC Comics? I assume that you worked on Commandy and Demon.
Basically all the Kirby, New Gods, Forever People.
There were some other guys in DC.
There was a 3 month. There was about a 3 month.
After some other guys.
Well, there was about. I started the 4th Vertical books with the 5th issues of everything, and I actually wound up doing a few Jimmy Olsen's. But halfway through the tenure at DC, I took a backpacking trip, and I'm sitting on the plaque on the top of Mount Whitney, and I'm thinking, I am working too damn hard. So when I came down off the mountain, I called Jack and I said, Jack, I'd like to only ink half of the books. And in essence, he said, all or nothing, because he did not want a variety of styles. I understood that. And so I was faced with doing other work. Well, I wound up writing and drawing a 44-page chain album, drawing some Tarzan comic book stories, one page of which is all Russ Manning's inks over microid pencil.
You know, the New Gods are going to be a movie next year.
But I don't know how I went back to Jack, but about 3 months later, I'm working full-time for Jack again. But towards the end of our relationship, I told him, I said, Jack, I want to stretch my wings. And his philosophy was always do your own thing. And so he accepted me leaving. We were still friends for years after that. And Russ Manning asked me if I would totally ink the Tarzan Sunday strips and Star Wars.
Was that after Jack came back to Marvel?
Yeah. And Russ, bless his heart, the last full story of the Sunday Tarzan strips, he signed them, Manning and Royer. But also, Russ used me as an excuse when he was late with some of the Star Wars dailies. I would drive to his house to pick up work, and his wife would say, oh, he and Roger, his son, are out fishing. And it's like, I'm not picking up any work. I'm not doing my weekly quota, which was based on how much I would earn. And if he was late at Black Falcon, the shell company for Lucasfilm, he said, well, I've been having problems with my assistant, which was the easiest answer. Sparky Moore at the same time called me and said, Disney is looking for somebody in their freelance foreign strip and comic book division. So I went in, took some samples, and for a few weeks, did a couple of things. They called me one day and said, would you like to come in and talk about your future? And I thought, well, it'd be a regular freelance gig. And they said, how would you like to come on staff? And, as the hard-boiled detective would say, in less time than it takes to tell, I said, yes.
At the Disney studio?
Yeah.
So this is in the Burbank with the tower and all that?
Burbank.
Hey, so on the topic of, but on the DC books.
We talked about Benny. Some people love him, a lot of people hate him because he changed Jack's work. And then we recognized Joe Sinnott as a great Marvel inker for Jack, and Mike taking over at DC and then coming back to Marvel with Jack. And but I would like to mention one more inker of the historical significance with Jack is Wally Wood. A lot of people don't remember because when they did most of their work together was in the 50s. But Mike's old enough to remember, and I'd like to, if you would say something about Wood and Jack working together.
Well, I grew up in love with Wally Wood's work. I'm talking about Avon Comics before EC. I loved Wally Wood. And I was living in Oregon, and the Oregon Journal, which was one of the 2 daily papers, carried Sky Masters. And of course, I loved it because there was a character named Dr. Royer. But I looked at the strips, and they were signed Kirby and Wood. Now, of course, Wood was the last name of the writers. But since I recognized instantly that it's Wally Wood's inks, it was, to me, it was Jack Kirby and Wally Wood.
And Wally was the one that signed that signature that said Wood. Oh, really?
But I loved that strip.
He did the letter.
Kirby did the Gothic lettering of Wood.
The Sky Masters was not signed in Wood's Gothic lettering. Wood did the lettering on the strip as well as the inking embellishment. So I make the point because people will argue that signature Kirby Wood was for Wood the writer. I'm like, when Wood lettered that Wood, you better believe he was thinking about himself. He wasn't thinking about the writer. All right.